Welcome to Road to 250. Today we will be talking about the adrenal cortex, adrenal steroid hormone synthesis, and congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So we're going to start with some anatomy of the adrenal gland. So the adrenal gland has two main regions, the cortex and the medulla. The cortex being derived from mesoderm, and the medulla being derived from neural crest, which is part of ectoderm. So the cortex can be divided into three particular zones called the glomerulosa, the fasciculata, and the reticularis. And you can see their histological differences here. And then you have the medulla portion down here, which has its chromaffin cells, and you'll get more blue staining of the medulla, which is kind of how you can, if you get an image in histology, how you can kind of orient yourself for which way these zones are going. So the zona glomerulosa is regulated by angiotensin II, and it produces the mineralocorticoids, primarily aldosterone. And the fasciculata is regulated by ACTH mostly, and produces glucocorticoids, primarily cortisol. And then the reticularis is also regulated by ACTH mostly, and produces the androgens, primarily DHEA. And then in the medulla, there is innervation from the preganglionic sympathetic fibers to the adrenal medulla, which produces catecholamines, primarily epinephrine and norepinephrine. So a little mnemonic that first aid uses is the deeper you go, the sweeter it gets. So, you have salt and sugar and sex with mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and androgens going this way. So a little bit more about why this is important. There are some consequences if adrenal function is lost. Say, for example, if there is loss of function within the glomerulosa, this area here, you will have an absence of aldosterone, and that can result in loss of sodium, decreased volume of the ECF. Because of that, low blood pressure, circulatory shock, and all of that can lead to death. And in the other two zones, without cortisol, it can result in circulatory failure because catecholamines don't exert their normal vasoconstrictive action without cortisol, and there is an inability to mobilize energy sources such as glucose and free fatty acids, which is another function of cortisol. And this can become a problem under stressful situations and cause severe issues, resulting in fatal hypoglycemia. And just a little additional fact here, if problems develop within the anterior pituitary, glucocorticoid secretion may be affected, but mineralocorticoid system remains intact because of where the regulation comes from, angiotensin II, rather than our ACTH from the anterior pituitary. Okay, so any questions on that before we move on to more in-depth steroid hormone synthesis?
No, all good.
Okay.
Not yet.
So, I'm sure we've all seen this image in first aid or variations of it in other resources. So, the starting point in steroid hormone synthesis is the transport of cholesterol into the mitochondria by this protein called STAR, which stands for steroidogenic acute regulatory protein. And it's important to know that this is also the rate limiting step here. And then the conversion of cholesterol to pregnenolone is side chain cleavage enzyme, which is also called cholesterol desmolase. So this kind of gets the first two steps started for the rest of our steroid synthesis pathway going on. So we're going to start with the glomerulosa. So let me just also mark that here. We have our GFR going on here. So starting with the glomerulosa, as I mentioned before, angiotensin II is the main stimulus to this area, and throughout at the end of this particular pathway, we are producing aldosterone, which is the major mineralocorticoid here. And the primary target tissue for aldosterone is the kidney, where it increases sodium reabsorption by the principal cells of the collecting ducts. It also promotes secretion of hydrogen by the intercalated cells and potassium also by the principal cells. And this sodium conservation action is also seen not only in the kidney, but as well as in the salivary ducts, sweat glands, and the distal colon. So a little bit more in depth on what we can do now that aldosterone has been synthesized. So it promotes the activity of the sodium-potassium ATPase-dependent pump, which moves sodium into the renal ECF in exchange for potassium. So we have sodium going in, potassium going out, and this being promoted by aldosterone. It also enhances the epithelial sodium channels, called ENaC, on the luminal membrane of the principal cells, and this increases sodium resorption as well, which also in turn increases water absorption because water follows sodium. And the resorption of sodium also creates a negative luminal potential over here. So the more sodium we have, the more potential we have for pushing potassium out. And there is also a stimulation of hydrogen secretion again through the intercalated cells. And this is clinically important because excess aldosterone can cause an alkalosis this way, and insufficient aldosterone can cause an acidosis. Primarily type 4 renal tubular acidosis. And I've included just a little table to summarize all of the actions of aldosterone, where increasing sodium, increasing water, getting rid of potassium and hydrogen, and also producing bicarb. Okay, so now for our other two zones, since we've already talked about the glomerulosa, now we're talking about the fasciculata and reticularis, and our two main products here are cortisol and our adrenal androgens. So cortisol is the main glucocorticoid that's secreted by the adrenal cortex, and it is responsible for most of the hypothalamic and anterior pituitary negative feedback control for ACTH secretion. And adrenal androgens are water soluble. They are a significant secretion, but they only really produce pathological effects when secretion is excessive, such as masculinization in women and precocious puberty in men. So, a little bit more about glucocorticoid production and what cortisol specifically does. Like I said before, cortisol promotes the mobilization of energy stores. So, specifically for proteins, it will promote degradation and increase delivery of hepatic gluconeogenic precursors. As far as lipids, it'll promote lipolysis and delivery of free fatty acids and glycerol. And as far as carbohydrates, cortisol will raise blood glucose so that it is available for nervous tissue. And it does this by two mechanisms. It'll counteract insulin's action in most tissues, which is why cortisol is known as a counter-regulatory substance. And it'll also increase hepatic output of glucose by regulating the gluconeogenesis enzymes, specifically PEP. And cortisol enhances the capacity of glucagon and catecholamines, which is known as its permissive action. So, a lot of things can alter the production of these steroids. You can have hyper or hypocortisolism, hyper or hypo androgenism, etc., etc. But what we are going to focus on today is specifically the enzyme deficiencies within the steroid hormone synthesis pathways. You can have single enzyme defects, and they can occur as inborn errors of metabolism. A defect in any of these enzymes can lead to deficient cortisol secretion, and these syndromes are called congenital adrenal hyperplasias. And the reason it is a hyperplasia is because there is excessive secretion of ACTH, because we have lost that negative feedback of cortisol. So that is no longer there. So when we get to the next section, we're going to assume that all of these deficiencies are significant to the effect that it affects normal hormonal production, but not necessarily a complete blockade. And just a quick way to think about these enzyme deficiencies as we look at them along our chart. Just to know that if there is a horizontal cut in a pathway, it's going to decrease production of all substances below the cut and increase secretion of substances above. And as far as any vertical cuts, it's going to decrease substances to the right and increase substances to the left. Okay. So we're going to start with 17 alpha hydroxylase deficiency. So as you can see, 17 alpha hydroxylase is marked in red here. This is going to result in decreased adrenal androgens, including testosterone, estrogens, and also decreased cortisol. So because it's blocking this direction, we won't have any of these, no cortisol, and increased ACTH as this system is being backed up. So our pathway is primarily going to follow here and cause an increased production of our mineralocorticoids and all of its precursors as well, and an increased amount of 11-deoxycorticosterone can also lead to hypertension, as well as this whole pathway as well. And angiotensin 2 is going to be reduced. Wanting to control this extra production of mineralocorticoids that we have going on, because we cannot go in this direction. Does that make sense?
Yes. So it's the decrease in the cortisol production, which is stimulating the increase in ACTH, thereby creating this, cyclic effect that is going nowhere.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's just being stuck within the glomerulosa, because that's the only steroid synthesis that can occur. And you have angiotensin 2 trying to help, but it's still doing this, leading to hypertension being our primary symptom here. Okay, so now we're going to move on to 21 beta hydroxylase deficiency, and that is this guy right here. And this one is a horizontal cut. So 21 beta hydroxylase is the most common of the three deficiencies we're going to talk about here. And it is blocking this whole level. So we're going to have a decreased production of aldosterone and a decreased production of cortisol also, since this is also blocked. So our steroid synthesis system is primarily going to go in this direction towards androgen formation. Okay. And last we have 11 beta hydroxylase deficiency, and that would be this guy right here, and another horizontal cut. So this deficiency is going to cause, again, decreased cortisol, decreased aldosterone, and also a push towards androgen synthesis. So, and again, because we have decreased cortisol, we do have increased ACTH, trying to compensate for that, and also overflushing this system. So the steroids that we are going to have an overproduction of are, like I said before, androgens, and the consequences that we see in women and prepubertal males, as well as this guy, 11-deoxycorticosterone. And because this particular precursor is not blocked, unlike what we saw in 21-hydroxylase, we are still going to get hypertension. Because this is a relatively weaker mineralocorticoid than aldosterone, but is still a mineralocorticoid where it can cause those effects. And because aldosterone is decreased, angiotensin II is not needed to counteract its effect. So you will have low levels of angiotensin II rather than high that we saw before. And from first aid, just to summarize these three again, with 17 alpha hydroxylase, that was the one that we saw going this direction, so or blocking our ability to form sex hormones, and also blocking our ability to form glucocorticoids. So we were only able to produce our hormones within the glomerulosa, which is why we have only an increase in mineralocorticoids. And because of that, we are going to see a increase in blood pressure and a decrease in potassium also. And on labs, you can see a reduction in the amount of androstenedione relating to your sex hormone production here. And on a physical presentation, you can see males with ambiguous genitalia or undescended testes, or females that lack secondary sexual development. Again, because of our decrease in sex hormones here. And 21-hydroxylase, that was our first horizontal cut. And that one, you are going to see a reduction in mineralocorticoid because we're blocking that column, and we are also blocking the column for the fasciculata, so we have a decrease in cortisol. So our synthesis is shunted towards sex hormone production. And because there is a decrease in mineralocorticoids, we're also going to see a decrease in blood pressure and an increase in potassium concentration. And on labs, you can see increased renin activity because of our low BP and increase in 17-hydroxyprogesterone, which is related to our sex hormones as well. And remember, this is the most common of these enzyme deficiencies, and it can present in infancy with salt wasting, or during childhood with precocious puberty, or in females, virilization. Again, because you have very high sex hormones. And last, we have our 11-beta hydroxylase, which was another horizontal cut that was one level below 21. And this one also has a decrease in mineralocorticoids, but specifically in aldosterone. However, we do still have our 11-deoxycorticosterone, which is why in this case we have an increase in blood pressure rather than a decrease, and decreased potassium concentration because of that, and decreased renin activity instead of what you see here. Cortisol is again reduced, and your sex hormones here are also increased, which can result in virilization. And some additional findings for all of these, you can see skin hyperpigmentation because of MSH production, which has the same precursor as ACTH, so they'll get produced and secreted together. And because you have low cortisol across the board, you're going to have increase of ACTH, as well as bilateral adrenal gland enlargement, also because of that increased ACTH. And all of these names and stuff can get a little confusing, so it helps to think about if the deficient enzyme starts with a 1, it can cause hypertension. And if the deficient enzyme ends with a 1, it can cause virilization in females. So another way to think about it is if you make a little chart with blood pressure on one side and sex standing for sex hormones and androgens on the other side, and write in the numbers, but replace the ones with arrows. So we have 17, 21, and 11. You can see that 21 and 11 both have increased sex hormones, same here, and 17 and 11 both have increased blood pressure, as you can see here. Make sense?
I'm glad you did that thing at the end there, because literally everything, this entire presentation so far, this little chart that you made right there at the bottom, that'll answer every fucking question that you will ever encounter in this realm of questions. No joke. The only other thing that this, that horrible chart from 2 slides ago that is relevant, aside from your little BP sexy thing, which thank you, Conrad Fisher, is knowing 17 hydroxyprogesterone and knowing 11 deoxycorticosterone are the enzymes which are increased due to the deficiency of 21 and 11 hydroxylase deficiencies respectively, because those are some shitty step 1 questions that I've seen plenty. So that little BP sex chart with the arrows and knowing those 2 specific hormones, that they are the ones that are elevated in the deficiency, are questions that will be asked. And that's just because the question is, what hormone do you test for to see if this hormone is deficient? That's always going to be the question. So those are the biggest take-home points from everything that you just went over. In summary.
I'll just put little stars next to these guys. So
No, it's all good. I'm just saying that I'm just saying that from the questions that I've seen, that's where the big money is.
Good to know. Okay. All right, so a little more on some of the consequences of these deficiencies. So again, the first one we talked about on that chart was 17 alpha hydroxylase. Now this one is extremely rare and is usually diagnosed again at the time of puberty. Like we talked about, it's the first number, that's a 1, so you're going to have hypertension. And because of that, you're going to have hypokalemia and hypogonadism, as you can remember with the second number being a 7. So individuals can have eunuchoid characteristics because they're not producing their sex hormones. In 11, beta hydroxylase deficiency. This was the bottom one. You can see clinical features of increased androgens that'll be similar to the ones here that I'll talk about in a second, including virilization of the female fetus. And you will have hypertension, again here, remember the first number being a 1, due to that 11-deoxycorticosterone, again, our special guy here, along with hypokalemia because of that hypertension and suppressed renin secretion. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. But our last one, 21 beta hydroxylase deficiency. This is our most common, accounting for about 90% of cases. 75 of which having mineralocorticoid deficiency. Neonates, again, can present with that salt wasting crisis that I mentioned. Here you will have hyponatremia with hyperkalemia and raised plasma renin because of that. And our important hormone here, 17-hydroxyprogesterone being elevated. And again, because our second number is a 1, we're going to have increased androgens leading to virilization of the female fetus and sexual ambiguity at birth, with males being phenotypically normal at birth, but developing precocious pseudopuberty, growth acceleration, premature epiphyseal plate closure, and diminished height. And the goal in treatment is to bring glucocorticoid and mineralocorticoid levels back to the normal range here, and also to suppress that adrenal androgen secretion. Hydroxycortisone specifically can be given to act as a feedback inhibition on the pituitary because, again, we are lacking cortisol in all of these. So the treatment for all forms of congenital adrenal hyperplasia is glucocorticoids, specifically hydroxycortisone or dexamethasone. Okay. Any questions about any of that before I quiz you guys?
No, but you just brought up a good point that a lot of people forget is that all three of those, 17, 20, and 11, the thing to remember is that all three of them have cortisol decrease or absence of a formation of cortisol. It's just whether it's aldosterone or androgens that are being formed is kind of the caveat to each one of those individual ones. And like you showed with the BP sexy thing, the ones really do correlate to whether it's androgen, aldosterone, or both. But no cortisol is being made.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, I'm done.
Okay, you guys ready for some quiz questions? Start with the first one. We have a 13-year-old girl is brought to the physician by her mother for her yearly physical examination. Her temperature is 98 degrees Fahrenheit, blood pressure is 152/91, pulse is 75, and respirations are 18. Physical exam shows a lack of secondary sexual characteristics, and pelvic examination shows a blind vagina. Laboratory studies reveal hypokalemia and low testosterone and estradiol levels. Cytogenic analysis shows a 46XY karyotype. Which of the following enzymes is most likely to be deficient in this patient?
I'm going with C.
She's got high blood pressure,
Mm-hmm.
low testosterone, no female secondary sexual characteristics. B.
Did you say? I didn't.
B for boy.
Okay.
Big.
B is correct. So if we're solely going off our BP sex chart here, increased blood pressure that we can see, but no increase in, or a lack of sex hormone production, which is why we have low testosterone and lack of secondary sexual characteristics.
Yeah, if it had been 11, she would have had ambiguous genitalia, as well as breast development and probably hirsutism or something like that.
Right, well, an actual.
All right, so yeah.
Okay. Next question. I have a 2-year-old girl is brought to the clinic by her mother for evaluation of ambiguous genitalia. She was born with clitoral enlargement and partial fusion of the labioscrotal folds. The patient has also had high blood pressure recorded on 2 consecutive office visits. She has been tracking at the 50th percentile for height and weight and has not had any other medical problems. Family history is non-contributory. Lab studies are significant for moderate hypokalemia. Cytogenic studies show a 46XX karyotype. Which of the following enzymes is most likely deficient in this patient?
C for cat.
Anybody else?
Agreed.
C is correct. So yeah, so we can see ambiguous genitalia and high blood pressure going on. So we have both the BP and the sex hormone synthesis being increased. And also, a little extra fact, know that with increased sex hormone synthesis, you have premature closure of the epiphyseal plates, so decreased height as well. And last question. A 23-year-old woman gives birth to a full-term neonate. The newborn's vital signs are within normal limits. Physical exam shows ambiguous genitalia and clitoromegaly. Lab studies reveal elevated serum levels of testosterone and androstenedione. Karyotype testing shows a 46XX genotype. Ultrasound of the infant's pelvis shows a normal-sized uterus. The mother experiences facial hair growth and voice deepening during the pregnancy. Which of the following enzymes is most likely to be deficient in the newborn?
So she's got elevated testosterone, but the fact that mom is affected is a different issue.
Aromatase? D?
It's either C or D, yeah.
D?
Is D the one that affects mom?
D is correct.
Yeah, the mom thing, yeah.
Yeah, so the mother experiencing facial hair growth and voice deepening, so maternal virilization, can occur with aromatase deficiency in the infant, but not with 21-hydroxylase. That won't affect
Yeah, so
mom.
that won't affect mom, that would just affect baby. Okay.
Any questions about any of these questions? You good?
No, but if you want to go back like a lot of slides when you're talking about cortisol, what cortisol does, I have an interesting clinical correlate that I just had this question today, so there you go. So highlight cortisol counteracts insulin's actions. It's like the third to last point down. Okay, so I got this question today. It was, again, I'm doing OB, so the question was essentially, what is the mechanism behind gestational? Okay, so one of the risk factors for just a mother with gestational diabetes to the fetus is that it will cause pulmonary insufficiency due to decreased surfactant. And the question was essentially, what is the mechanism behind respiratory distress syndrome in neonates born from mothers with gestational diabetes? And the mechanism is that increased insulin from mom decreases cortisol levels, and decreased cortisol levels leads to decreased surfactant levels. So if you have mom with high insulin that isn't controlled, she's going to decrease the surfactant. So this is where, at least at OB clinically, this cortisol counteracts insulin's actions. So if you have high insulin, you're going to have low cortisol. Lungs aren't going to, or the fetal lungs aren't going to mature properly in utero, and then you're going to have a baby born either prematurely or with premature lungs. So that was my little aha moment I had today with with that question.
Interesting.
Yeah. So insulin and cortisol go whoop, whoop, like that. That's all I got as far as this lecture goes for today.
Anybody else have anything they want to add? Toss in here? Well, that's all I have.
Well, that was a good review.